The Saedraverse is a world-building project in the making since 2004. Its name derives the divine race and general main characters of the setting. There are vast amounts of worlds, from sci-fi city planets to fantasy feudal worlds, inhabiting our familiar creatures, dinosaurs, dragons, elves and dwarves, to the more alien, spec evil, and Eldritchian beings. Its magic, the Alnu, is a chaotically manifested force. Location and belief influence how it is perceived. Today, we're going to look closer into the event that birthed the current reality of the Saedraverse, an event that's called the Athalosoch. We'll expand upon details mentioned in the very first video, how little is known from that time, and what inspired me to create this event. Before that, it's important we have a brief mention of the Centauri, the name to those who were preserved during the catastrophe, and their descendants. Despite the eons of time that would pass between then and the birth of the first Saedra, the survivors wouldn't share much of their experience during that time. Even those who did offered a vague telling of the events. This is what is known. Existence was peaceful. Ailments that afflict the universe in its current being, disease, death, simply did not exist. The concept of worry was unheard of. All sophants gave worship to the goddess. Now, none knew what, where, and when it started. The common belief nowadays is that it originated with man, Homo sapiens, but even so, that is not guaranteed. Heresy had entered existence. Why can't we rule ourselves? Why can't we judge right and wrong? Why does she rule us? Were there chants? And like a disease of today, the heresy spread. Those witness to such a display were indignant. For where was the logic of those crying? What has she done for us? In a universe of such splendor and beauty. The goddess was grief-stricken, but her soul prevented any discipline. She wished for them to be unharmed. She could not bring herself to judge them accordingly, and forbade any retaliation from the rest of her children. As the ages passed, however, righteous indignation grew in the hearts of many. Eventually, those with such hearts would act, ignoring the will of the goddess, deluding themselves that it was her desire, her will. To them, the name Zealots was given. The rivalry between them and the heretics would birth violence the likes of which would never be seen again, and the emergence of concepts such as war, bigotry, and corruption. Despite the growing calamity, the goddess, just like the initial rise of the heretics, could not bring herself to discipline the warring factions, to harm her creations, for she knew the only possible solution was permanent death. Even despite the near hourly atrocities both heretics and zealots committed, she knew she needed and wanted to act. But her love was vastly misguided. A vast and terrifying genocide awaited those who remained true to the goddess at the hands of the heretics and zealots. Their hatred so blinding that neutrality did not exist. If you were not with them, then you were their enemy. How long this time of chaos went on is unknown. Survivors offered no answer there, only that after some time, the goddess would finally act. To those who remained faithful, she gave the order to flee to the Ironhawed galaxy, to the human homeworld of Anura. This was no safe journey, however. Unknown numbers would be massacred. It was in this time some would forgo their neutrality, taking up the mantle of defending the faithful. They knew the goddess had something planned, and so it chose to sacrifice whatever life they could have, so that others may live. The goddess even finally taking some action, as all beasts turned to join the defense. It was the closing day of that age, with hostiles besieging them. The blinding light would emanate out from Anura. expanding, defying the very speed of light, and enveloping the entire universe. In mere moments, it would end, and the faithful would gaze upon a silent, lifeless universe. Outside their haven, and there was no longer a world of life and greenery. It was now a great, primordial hellscape. The survivors were lost. They cried for their creator. The now cold silence of the universe was all that answered. While they mourned those they lost, they would find that they weren't completely alone, for the beasts that helped defend them had been given the gift of sapience. A week would pass, in which they would awaken to a familiar presence, its source coming from an unusual creation, cast in blue divine light and ever-changing its appearance, the Vidrix. Upon them, it bestowed the name of the Centauri, in the final act of the goddess revealed. Though saddened by her sacrifice, her ultimate will freed them from much misery and despair, gifting them and all that would be reborn the new hope of the Saedra. Myths and legends. Time and a lack of knowledge will result in speculation in order to fill the gaps. Thus it's understandable that myths should arise of the time of the Athalosoch. But that is all they are: myths, legends, and speculation. Not even the Saedra would come to know the true history and events of the Athalosoch. Some, while harmless enough, would grow to develop a malignant nature. Look no further than the first to fall. To the Centauri, it was no more than mere speculation why humans and the Celtic race disproportionately birthed the Saedra compared to other species, believing that perhaps the great heresy originated with Homo sapiens and even a Celtic precursor. Outside the hands of the Centauri though, however, this myth would be wielded with nefarious intent. Used to demonize those such preachers despised. Humans suffered the most at such speculation, but with no knowledge of who did fall first, others were just as likely to be targeted. A sub-myth would even spawn from this with just as much maliciousness, sole purpose of which was to ostracize a certain gender, proclaiming the instigating individual to be a gender of the preacher's ire. While most myths delved into the time of chaos, another set would delve even further back in time and speculate creation itself. Just how did the goddess create all things? How did life truly come about? Was it literal or more metaphoric? Had she created human, dragon and elf in their truest form? Or was it the creation and guidance of evolution? 4.4 billion years was enough time to witness the rise of cellular life on lifeless planets through to the great forms that roamed them today. Was it perhaps both? Whereas forms from before returned to the universe, depending on planet, they would be able to evolve better forms. Despite the differences of each though, a commonality was the likening of the goddess to an artist, perfecting their craft over time, to form an explanation for the seeming primitive biology of humans, compared to the likes of elves and fae. Perhaps the most speculative and trivial belief is one that involves the very nature of the goddess. It is also the youngest, only being thought of in final years of the wait for the Saedra. It would also be limited to the Centauri and the Saedra themselves, viewed more as a fun idea rather than anything serious. It involved the idea that a goddess was part of a higher plane of existence, a divine plane and divine race, each individual a god in their own right, a ruler and creator of their own universe. At this point, I'm going to say thank you for watching this video, as from here I'm delving into more meta, talking about the inspiration and the whys. So if you just want the part where I'm talking as if describing historical events, and then feel free to end the video here. Though please do let me know if you'd prefer these meta parts being like their own separate video. Now as for the rest of you, let's get into my thought process. So there's kind of 3 reasons why I ended up creating the Athalosoch. One was my frustration with certain works pulling the whole "there is a prophecy" and there being no explanation on where the prophecy came from. Now, that'll be more discussed on a video on the Vidrex, but even with the Vidrex, with regards to that subject, you'd still get similar questions. Where did that come from and such? Similarly related was the Alnu, aka the magic. The question of where it came from and how did mortals learn it? In settings that seem to lack gods, I have similar questions of where did it come from, how did people learn it? So the idea of the goddess creating beings naturally attuned to the Alnu and her death releasing her remnant spirit and power across the universe was to serve as my answer. What about the goddess herself? Why have her be dead? So this originates back to a time when I was extremely religious. In fact, in the early days after I'd given it the name, the Saedraverse, a god was meant to have a constant presence. I ran off from the pre-Saedra days, where it was set in our universe, and God and Satan were involved. It was 2011 I would see the Saedra go from, servants of God, to being, the godly race they are now. In small part because I wanted to pull both religious and atheists are right. And yeah, at the time, that was my answer. So divine creation and intelligent design are a thing, but at the same time, there's no God and evolution exists. Okay, yeah, it's a weird logic. Yes, I laugh at it now, especially for the person I've become, but at the same time, I'm happy, as the Saedraverse wouldn't be the way it is currently without that weird logic. Ultimately, it all ties in as why the Saedra needed to be a thing. Something that'll be expanded upon in their own video. See, this is a sandbox universe to play around and create stories in, and despite my heavy focus on them, the Saedra technically should be a small part in the vastness of this universe, even though their role has major implications. The Athalosoch was an answer to the why. So the idea itself came from a reading of various pages on the TV Tropes website. The Dark Times, Galter Demarone, End of an Age, The Before Times, After the End, and From Cataclysm to Myth. That in turn led to being inspired by a combination of, myths, in particular the Greek Golden Ages, and, the first 9 chapters of Genesis, and even taking inspiration from J.R.R. Tolkien's Fall of Numenor. The Fall of Mortals is also kind of taken from my time as a Jehovah's Witness, with how we believed both man and Satan's logic to Jehovah's right to rule. Well, the idea of the goddess not taking action against, the heretics and zealots, that was from parents being scared to discipline their kids. Her death was inspired by reading about pantheism, a belief in which the creator is the universe, though back in my initial readings of it, it was described more as the creator killing themselves to create the universe. And yes, you may be wondering if I was also influenced by Christ's sacrifice. I'm going to say consciously no, but I have to wonder if my subconscious was inspired by it. As for why so few details of this period of time, and why the idea of myths, it's because I largely wanted this period to be mysterious, inspired by the pre-biblical flood times. Even comparing what of that period biblically is known to similar information of the Athalosoch. I question if I'm revealing too much. I also took from the experience of soldiers from both world wars and PTSD and trauma, with stories of some just refusing to talk about their time in service, as well as trauma responses. As for the myths themselves, well, the Who was the first to fall. It takes inspiration from both Pandora's box and the serpent seducing Eve, and how misogynists would use that against women throughout history. And as well as, the general hatred against Jews for their role in Christ's death, which is used to ostracize them and that. Now, some can likely guess the creation myth one. It's inspired by the real life debate of evolution versus creationist discourse. And as for the last one that's mentioned, the whole goddess is part of a divine being realm myth, that was just a fun idea I had once with regards, dimensions, multiverse, and crossovers with other franchises. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is the end of it. I didn't expect a year and 8 months to go by before I got to the next one, and for kind of what's a small part in the grand scale of the whole Saedraverse. It's also completely different to my first one. Primarily, it ain't exactly much of a video, which I think is part of the issue I had in getting this done. Like, I was kind of paralyzed myself with regards art I'd have to do, just kind of all the different things to truly illustrate the Athalosoch. I don't have money, unfortunately, to pay people to, create art for it. I can't afford it. I have to rely on myself, and I also have my own projects to do, as some of the artwork in this was stuff I'd done since, but that was very little compared to ones I'd done before. So settling to do it in this format, I guess you could say, allowed me to actually get it done. This is probably how I'm going to do my videos going forward. Largely, my idea is to listen, and maybe once I get to a point, or if I cover a subject where I've already done a lot of artwork for it, it'll make it more of a video. Now, I would like to hear folks' thoughts regarding, we'll just call it the meta part of this vid, the last 5 minutes, and if it's something I should continue doing, like all the videos on a subject in the Saedraverse have like this part, or I do them separate. So with all that said, I'm going to thank you again, third time, and I hope I'll see you on the next video. As they say in Scottish Gaelic, cheery and rasta.